Why were two boys on their way home after a simple game of basketball pursued and attacked on the streets of Melbourne's west? That question now hangs heavily over a community struggling to comprehend the scale of what has occurred. On a Saturday evening in Cobble Bank, a relatively quiet suburb some 35 kilometres from the CBD, 8 masked youths armed with machetes are alleged to have descended on their victims with devastating speed. What followed was a brief but brutal confrontation in a public space, leaving residents shocked and families shattered. 2 young lives ended at the roadside, and with them a sense of safety that many in the local community had taken for granted. The attack has drawn attention not only for its violence, but also for the broader concerns it raises about youth gang activity and the challenges of policing armed offenders. As news of the tragedy spread, so too did questions about how such an event could take place in a suburban neighbourhood and what it reveals about the systems meant to protect young people. To understand the impact fully, it is necessary to look more closely at the victims themselves and the lives that were so abruptly cut short. Cobble Bank sits on the western fringe of Melbourne, within the municipality of Melton. It is a suburb marked by rapid development, new housing estates, and a population made up largely of young families. Many of those families have roots in migrant communities, drawn to the area for its relative affordability and opportunities to establish a home. Despite its promise as a place of growth, Cobble Bank has also carried concerns about youth gang activity and the challenges of integrating young people into a safe and stable environment. Against this backdrop lived 2 boys whose lives were cut short. Dao Akueng was 15 years old, a secondary school student known among friends for his calm manner and dedication to basketball. He represented the aspirations of a family that had settled in Melbourne seeking stability and a future for their children. His companion that evening, 12-year-old Chol Achek, was the youngest of the pair. He too was drawn to basketball, a sport that gave him a sense of belonging and joy. Both boys had finished a game and were walking home when their paths crossed with the group who would soon end their lives. For the community in Cobble Bank, these were not anonymous figures. They were local children whose families were known in schools, churches, and sporting clubs. The shock of their deaths resonated far beyond the immediate families, touching parents who feared for their own children and highlighting anxieties that had already been present in the suburb. It is within this setting that the events of that Saturday night unfolded. To understand the scale of the impact, it is necessary to trace how the confrontation took place, from the moment the boys left the court to the attack that would claim their lives. On the evening in question, Cobble Bank presented much like any other Saturday. The streets were quiet, with most families already at home. The basketball courts where Dao Akueng and Chola Chiek had played earlier had emptied, and the 2 boys began the short walk back to their houses. What awaited them was an encounter that would end in violence, recorded in part on local CCTV cameras and witnessed by a handful of residents. At approximately 7:20 p.m, a group of around 8 individuals moved into the area. Each was masked, their faces deliberately concealed, and several carried machetes and other long-bladed weapons. Police later alleged that this group acted in concert, approaching the boys in a coordinated fashion. The vision retrieved from CCTV would later form a central piece of evidence, outlining the moments that followed. The footage shows Chol, the younger of the pair, attempting to escape. He ran across the street only to stumble and fall to the ground. In those moments, he became defenceless. Members of the group closed in and struck him repeatedly while he was on the ground. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Not far away, Dao faced a similar fate. Confronted by others in the group, he too was set upon and fatally wounded. The precise number of attackers involved with each boy remains the subject of ongoing investigation, but the fact of their vulnerability is beyond dispute. Neighbours who heard the commotion stepped outside, but were forced to retreat, frightened by the scale of the assault and the sight of weapons being brandished. Some dialed emergency services, their calls placing Victoria Police and paramedics on immediate notice. Those calls conveyed panic and disbelief, describing masked figures running through the street and 2 boys lying critically injured. By the time first responders arrived, it was too late to provide life-saving treatment. Both Dow and Chall had died at the scene, their bodies lying only metres apart. Police secured the area, while paramedics confirmed there was nothing further that could be done. The scene quickly became one of controlled urgency as investigators moved in to preserve evidence. The sudden loss of 2 young lives in such a public manner shocked the local community. It was not a crime hidden from view or carried out in isolation. Rather, it unfolded on open streets where families resided and children often played. This aspect amplified the sense of fear and disbelief among residents. The images from CCTV, though not released publicly in full, are said to illustrate the speed and ferocity of the incident, leaving little doubt about the coordination of the group. From this point, attention shifted to the task of determining how the attack was organised, who was responsible, and whether it was targeted or random. With the victims confirmed deceased at the scene, the focus turned squarely to the investigative phase. This required examining the evidence left behind, identifying potential suspects, and considering the broader context of youth violence in Melbourne's western suburbs. It is to that investigative process that we now turn, tracing the steps taken by police in the hours and days immediately after the attack. Police cordoned off the scene within minutes of arriving, ensuring that evidence would be preserved and the immediate area secured. Officers from the local station were quickly joined by members of Victoria Police's homicide squad, reflecting the seriousness of the attack and the need for a coordinated investigation. The initial task was straightforward but urgent. Establish what had happened, who had been involved, and whether the threat to the public was ongoing. CCTV cameras from nearby shops and residential properties were identified and collected. These recordings provided investigators with crucial timelines, capturing movements of both the victims and the group of alleged offenders. While the images were not always clear, they confirmed the presence of multiple masked figures and gave detectives a starting point for mapping out the sequence of events. At the same time, officers canvassed the neighbourhood. Residents who had heard the disturbance or witnessed fragments of the attack were spoken to, and their accounts documented. Many described seeing a group of young people running through the streets with weapons, though most were unable to identify them due to the masks and the speed of the incident. Despite the limitations, these statements reinforced what had been seen on CCTV and added human context to the forensic record. From the outset, detectives treated the incident as potentially linked to youth gang activity. The manner of the attack, the number of people involved, and the choice of weapons all aligned with patterns previously observed in Melbourne's western suburbs. However, it was equally important to clarify the role of the victims. Police moved quickly to confirm that both boys were not associated with gangs, removing speculation that they may have been participants in the type of violence that had claimed their lives. The early stages of the investigation laid the foundation for what would follow. Establishing the victim's innocence changed the nature of the case, focusing attention squarely on the group responsible and the broad questions around how such an attack could occur. With evidence secured and witness accounts collected, detectives faced the more complex task of piecing together motive and identifying suspects, a process that would prove far from straightforward. Despite the swift actions taken by Victoria Police in the hours after the killings, several crucial elements of the case remain unresolved. The most pressing is the question of who, precisely, made up the group of 8 alleged offenders. Witnesses and CCTV confirmed their presence, masked and armed, but no individual has yet been publicly identified. Without clear names and faces, investigators have been left to work backwards, piecing together fragments of evidence in the hope of narrowing down the field of suspects. The issue of motive also hangs heavily over the case. Police have considered whether the attack was a targeted act of revenge, a confrontation connected to gang rivalries, or a tragic case of mistaken identity. Each possibility carries different implications. If the attack was directed at the boys themselves, it suggests a very different dynamic than if they were simply caught up in violence intended for others. To date, there is no evidence that either Dawa Kueng or Chola Chik were involved in gang activity, a finding that complicates the narrative and deepens the sense of injustice felt by their families and community. Weapons form another unresolved aspect. Officers recovered some items from the scene, but not all of the machetes and long blades reported by residents were found. This gap makes it difficult to confirm exactly how many weapons were used and by whom. It also raises the possibility that crucial forensic evidence may have been carried away by the offenders as they fled. Establishing the number and type of weapons is central not only to proving charges, but also to understanding the level of planning involved. The degree of organisation remains uncertain. On one hand, the coordinated appearance of 8 masked figures suggests a level of preparation that would point to an established group. On the other, youth violence in Melbourne has at times involved loosely connected individuals acting impulsively, with no central leadership or long-term structure. Determining whether this was a formal gang action or a spontaneous outburst is essential for anticipating further risk to the community. Finally, and most significantly, there have been no confirmed arrests or charges laid in relation to the incident. While police have continued to follow leads, the lack of named suspects underscores the challenges they face. The masks, the speed of the attack, and the limited visibility all contribute to an environment where witnesses cannot confidently identify those responsible. The absence of clear suspects leaves the case in a holding pattern, with investigators under pressure to deliver answers, but constrained by the limits of the evidence currently available. These unanswered questions frame the next stage of the investigation. Without clarity on identity, motive, weapons, or structure, the path to justice remains uncertain. For the families of Dao and Chol, the absence of progress compounds their grief, while for the wider community, it fuels fear and frustration. The investigation therefore continues with a dual focus, finding those responsible and addressing the wider concerns that the attack has brought to light. It is within this climate of uncertainty that the reactions of the community began to emerge, reflecting both sorrow and calls for stronger measures to prevent such violence in the future. In the days following the attack, the grief of the families was immediate and profound. Relatives of both boys spoke of children whose lives were centred on school, sport, and family, and who had no connection to the type of violence that claimed them. Their public statements carried a consistent plea that justice be done and that no other family be left to endure the same loss. For the community of Cobble Bank and the broader Melton area, the incident struck at the sense of security in their own neighbourhoods. Parents described heightened anxiety about letting their children walk alone, even in daylight. Local residents gathered for vigils, leaving flowers and candles near the scene and speaking openly about their fear that youth violence was moving too close to home. The visible presence of mourning in public spaces reflected both solidarity with the victims' families and deep unease about what the attack represented. The reaction extended well beyond the suburb. Across Victoria, media outlets reported the killings as one of the most shocking machete attacks in recent memory. The language used was careful but firm, framing the event as part of a troubling pattern of youth crime that had drawn repeated warnings from police and community leaders. Editorials questioned whether current measures were adequate, while commentary from civic groups called for stronger safeguards to protect young people. This combination of private grief and public concern created a climate in which the pressure for answers was intense. With families calling for justice and residents demanding safety, the focus shifted towards how political leaders and law enforcement would respond to the community's fears. The scale of the community's reaction placed immediate pressure on political leaders to act. Within days, the Victorian government faced mounting criticism that existing laws, particularly those governing bail, were inadequate in the face of violent youth crime. Commentators argued that the current framework allowed too many young offenders to remain in the community while awaiting trial, creating risks that were now being felt in the most tragic of circumstances. In response, senior ministers announced a suite of proposed reforms. Chief among them was a commitment to introduce a statewide ban on machetes, removing the availability of one of the weapons most associated with group violence. The government also pledged to tighten the bail system, signalling that young people accused of violent offences would face far stricter thresholds before being released. These measures were framed as a direct attempt to address public concern and to restore confidence in the justice system's ability to prevent similar crimes. At the same time, attention turned to the broader issue of youth gang activity. The attack in Cobble Bank was presented as evidence of a wider challenge in Melbourne's west, one that required not only legislative change but also sustained enforcement efforts. Officials promised stronger police responses to organised youth crime, alongside community initiatives aimed at reducing the risk of young people being drawn into violent groups. These announcements reflected both the grief of the families and the determination of the community to see change. They also set the stage for a continuing debate over how Victoria should balance rehabilitation for young offenders with the need for public safety, a debate that would only intensify as the investigation into the Cobble Bank attack continued. The killings in Cobble Bank have reverberated far beyond the immediate community. For many across Melbourne, the incident has become symbolic of a broader unease about youth gang activity, particularly in the city's west. Parents and community leaders have spoken of a rising fear that young people are being drawn into violent groups with little standing in the way of serious harm once weapons are involved. Public debate has quickly turned to questions of responsibility. Families are being urged to play a stronger role in guiding their children, while schools face renewed scrutiny over how they identify and respond to early signs of risk. Police and local councils are also under pressure, with calls for greater visibility, more proactive interventions, and better cooperation between agencies. The sense that no single institution can address the issue alone has become a central theme in these discussions. At the heart of the concern is a recognition that the problem extends beyond individual crimes. It reflects deeper challenges in how young people navigate identity, belonging, and opportunity in a rapidly changing society. The ease with which weapons can be obtained, combined with the vulnerabilities of adolescence, has created conditions where violence can escalate quickly. These realities underscore the urgency of broader solutions, setting the stage for the community to consider not only what went wrong, but what must change to prevent further loss. The tragedy in Cobble Bank serves as a stark reminder of how quickly violence can change the course of lives and communities. One clear lesson is the importance of vigilance. When troubling behaviour is seen, whether in public spaces or online, early reporting to authorities can provide opportunities to intervene before events escalate. Community safety is strengthened when residents feel empowered to act collectively, rather than waiting until harm has already occurred. The incident also underscores the role of families and schools in shaping the paths taken by young people. Guidance, supervision, and open dialogue are vital in reducing the risk of adolescents being drawn into groups that promote violence. Support networks, both formal and informal, can give young people a stronger sense of belonging and direction, reducing the appeal of gangs. From a legal perspective, the debate continues about how to balance rehabilitation with public safety. Ensuring that responses to youth crime are firm yet fair is central to protecting the wider community while not abandoning the chance of reform for offenders. Above all, the deaths of Dao Akueng and Chola Chiek highlight the human cost of violence. They remind us that each life lost represents not only personal grief, but a rupture in the fabric of community. It is this awareness that must guide efforts to prevent further tragedy. Two young boys walking home after a game of basketball lost their lives in circumstances that should never have been possible. Their deaths have left families grieving, a community shaken, and a city questioning how such violence could occur on its streets. The facts are clear. Dao Akueng and Chol Achiek were innocent victims, caught in an attack that exposed vulnerabilities in both law and community safety. Their families continue to call for justice, urging that those responsible be held accountable and that meaningful change follow from their loss. The vigils, the flowers and the words spoken in Cobble Bank, reflect not only sorrow, but a determination that their names will not be forgotten. As the investigation continues and policy reforms are debated, the memory of these boys stands as a reminder of what is at stake. The question that now lingers is whether new laws, stronger enforcement, and the shared efforts of families, schools, and communities will be enough to prevent another tragedy of this kind. It is a question that remains unanswered and one that will define how Victoria responds to the challenge of youth violence in the years ahead.